Take those chains off her, the Alpha King said, and for a moment, no one in the royal court remembered how to breathe. The sound of iron echoed across the marble floor as a young Omega knelt beneath hundreds of watching eyes. Elena Whitmore kept her gaze lowered. She had learned long ago that looking directly at nobles only invited trouble. Still, she could feel every stare on her shoulders, every whisper curling through the vast hall like cold wind. The chains around her wrists felt heavier than usual that morning. Their weight bit into her skin as she balanced a silver tray in trembling hands. Above her, crystal chandeliers cast rivers of golden light across polished stone. Around her, nobles dressed in velvet and jewels watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. To them, she was not a person. She was simply the court Omega. A servant. A reminder of what happened to those born without power. Elena swallowed carefully. Her throat felt tight. She focused on the tray. Focus on the task. Focus on surviving the day. That was how she had survived the last 3 months. But something had changed. The silence spreading through the hall felt different. Heavier. Dangerous. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. At the far end of the room, seated upon the obsidian throne, sat King Lucian Blackthorn. The Alpha King had returned from the northern frontier only 2 days earlier. Elena had heard the stories whispered by servants. They said rival rulers lowered their voices when speaking his name. They said entire territories united rather than challenge him. They said his presence alone could silence a crowded room. Looking at him now, Elena almost believed every story. He sat perfectly still beneath banners embroidered with silver wolves. Dark hair rested against the shoulders of his black royal armor. A crimson cloak flowed behind him like liquid fire. One hand rested near the sword at his side. The other gripped the arm of the throne. His silver-gray eyes never left her chains. The court remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the musicians standing along the wall seemed afraid to breathe. Elena's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Why was the king looking at her? She lowered her eyes immediately. Attention was dangerous. Attention always came before humiliation. Yet something inside her whispered that this moment felt different. Around the room, nobles exchanged nervous glances. The chain attached to Elena's wrist shifted softly as she adjusted her balance. The faint metallic sound traveled through the hall. Clink. The noise seemed impossibly loud. King Lucian's expression hardened. The temperature in the room felt as though it dropped 10 degrees. Elena could not understand why. She was nobody. A poor Omega from a forgotten village. A girl whose name had vanished the day the court placed iron around her wrists. Then the king rose to his feet. Gasps swept across the hall. Chairs scraped against stone. Elena's breath caught. Every instinct told her something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would change everything. 3 months earlier, before the chains, before the palace, before the kingdom knew her name, Elena Whitmore stood beneath a gray autumn sky and watched strangers place a price on her future. 3 months earlier, the wind carried the scent of approaching rain across the hills of Ashbrook Village as Elena Whitmore stood beside a weathered wooden fence and watched strangers ride toward her home. Their horses moved steadily along the dirt road, their dark cloaks rising and falling with every step. Even from nearly 100 yards away, Elena recognized the crest stitched onto their sleeves. The silver crown of Ravencrest Court. Fear tightened in her stomach. Villagers had spent the last week whispering about tax collectors, unpaid debts, and new orders coming from the capital. Elena had tried not to listen. Worry solved nothing when there was no money left to find. Behind her, the small farmhouse looked tired. The roof sagged slightly on one side. Several shutters hung crooked. The vegetable garden that once fed her family had struggled through a season of poor weather. Everything around her seemed to carry the same exhausted weight that lived inside her chest. The riders stopped in front of the house. Their leader climbed down first. He was dressed well, with polished boots and a long gray coat that looked expensive enough to buy half the village. He studied the property with a faint expression of disappointment before turning his attention toward Elena. His eyes moved over her simple dress, her worn shoes, and her dark hair gathered loosely behind her shoulders. "Elena Whitmore?" he asked. She nodded carefully. "I am Elena." The man removed a folded document from inside his coat. "By order of the regional magistrate, the Whitmore family debt has officially entered collection status." Elena's fingers tightened around the fence rail. She had known the debt existed. Everyone in the village knew. Her father had borrowed heavily before his death, hoping to save the farm after several difficult years. Instead, the debt survived longer than he had. "There must be some mistake," Elena said quietly. "We have been making payments." The man unfolded the document. "Not enough payments." The words landed like stones. Elena glanced toward the farmhouse window. Inside, her elderly aunt sat in a rocking chair, unaware of the conversation taking place outside. She was all the family Elena had left. "Please," Elena said. "We only need more time." The official looked unmoved. "Time expired 6 months ago." Silence stretched between them. The wind rustled through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the horizon. Elena suddenly felt very small beneath the enormous gray sky. The official studied her for a moment before speaking again. "The court has approved an alternative arrangement." Hope flickered briefly inside her chest. "An arrangement?" He nodded. "Service to the royal household." Elena frowned. "You mean employment?" The man hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but Elena noticed it. Her hope immediately began to fade. "The debt will be considered satisfied," he continued. "Your family will keep the farm. Your aunt will remain under protection." Elena's pulse quickened. Something about his careful wording felt wrong. Very wrong. "And what happens to me?" she asked. The official folded the document and slipped it back into his coat. His gaze shifted away for the first time. "Transportation to the capital arrives at sunrise tomorrow." A cold feeling spread through Elena's chest. The answer had not answered her question at all. And somehow, that frightened her more than any debt ever could. Elena barely slept that night. Rain tapped softly against the farmhouse windows while shadows drifted across the ceiling above her bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the official's expression again. Not cruel. Not angry. Somehow that made it worse. It was the look of a man delivering a decision that had already been made. Long before sunrise, Elena rose quietly and dressed in the simple brown dress she reserved for church services and special occasions. The fabric was old but carefully maintained. Her father used to say that dignity cost nothing. Standing before the small mirror hanging beside her bed, Elena tried to hold on to those words. Outside, dawn painted the horizon pale silver. The farm looked peaceful beneath the early morning light. Dew covered the fields. A few chickens wandered near the barn. Everything appeared exactly the same. Yet Elena felt as though an invisible line had been drawn through her life. One side belonged to the girl she had been yesterday. The other belonged to someone she had not met yet. Her aunt was waiting in the kitchen. The older woman sat quietly at the wooden table, a steaming mug resting between both hands. Her eyes looked red from a sleepless night. Elena forced a small smile. "You should have stayed in bed." Her aunt shook her head. "And miss my last breakfast with you?" The words struck harder than Elena expected. She lowered herself into the chair across from her. For several moments neither spoke. The silence felt fragile. Finally her aunt reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand. "Your father would be proud of you." Elena looked down. "I am not doing anything brave." "Yes, you are." Her aunt's voice softened. "You are choosing sacrifice when you could choose bitterness." Elena blinked rapidly. The knot in her throat tightened. Before she could answer, the sound of wagon wheels drifted through the open window. Both women froze. The transportation had arrived. Much sooner than Elena hoped. Outside, a black carriage rolled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. 2 court attendants stepped down. They wore neat uniforms and carried themselves with the rigid discipline of people trained never to question orders. Elena stood slowly. Her legs suddenly felt heavy. Every step toward the front door seemed harder than the last. At the threshold she stopped and looked back one final time. The kitchen. The fireplace. The faded curtains. The home where every memory of her family still lived. Tears threatened, but she swallowed them back. She wanted to leave with her head held high. The morning air felt cool against her face as she stepped outside. One attendant opened the carriage door. The other produced a small document and reviewed her name. Elena noticed something attached to his belt. A length of polished silver chain. Her stomach dropped. A cold wave of understanding swept through her chest. Service. Employment. Protection. None of those words had been the truth. The official from yesterday had hidden the reality behind careful language. Elena stared at the chain while fear slowly spread through every part of her body. For the first time since the riders arrived, she realized she was not being hired by the court. She was being claimed by it. The journey to Ravencrest took 2 full days. Elena spent most of that time staring through the carriage window as familiar farmland slowly disappeared behind her. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests. Small villages became distant memories. Every mile carried her farther from the life she understood. The silver chain rested beside the attendant throughout the trip, never attached to her, yet impossible to ignore. It remained a silent reminder of what waited ahead. By the second evening, the capital finally appeared on the horizon. Elena had never seen anything so enormous. Stone walls rose nearly 40 feet high, illuminated by hundreds of lanterns that glowed against the darkening sky. Towers pierced the clouds like giant spears. Crowds filled the streets beyond the gates. Merchants shouted from market stalls. Carriages rolled over cobblestones. Everywhere she looked, life moved faster than she thought possible. For a brief moment, wonder overcame fear. Then the carriage turned away from the city center and continued toward the royal grounds. The palace stood atop a hill overlooking everything below. White stone reflected the moonlight. Long banners bearing silver wolves drifted from balconies high above. The sight should have felt beautiful. Instead, Elena felt her stomach tighten. This was not a place she could belong. The carriage stopped in a courtyard surrounded by uniformed servants. The attendants escorted her through towering doors and into a vast reception hall. Marble floors stretched in every direction. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Elena had never imagined such wealth existed. A woman dressed in dark blue robes approached with a clipboard in hand. She appeared efficient, calm, and completely uninterested in conversation. "Name?" she asked. "Elena Whitmore." The woman wrote something down. "Former residence?" Elena answered. More notes followed. Finally the woman looked up. "Your designation will be Court Omega 17. Elena blinked. "Designation?" The woman closed the clipboard. "Names are rarely used among bonded service staff." The words landed harder than Elena expected. "But my name is Elena." "Not here." The answer came without cruelty. Somehow that made it feel colder. Another servant arrived carrying folded gray clothing. Simple. Plain. Identical to what dozens of others appeared to be wearing. Elena was escorted through winding hallways until she reached a lower wing of the palace reserved for service workers. Rows of narrow rooms lined both sides of a long corridor. The air smelled faintly of soap and candle wax. Her assigned room contained a small bed, a chair, and a single window overlooking a stone courtyard. Nothing more. She sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. For the first time since leaving home, she was completely alone. Silence filled the room. Elena touched the wooden wall beside her bed and closed her eyes. She tried to imagine her aunt sitting by the fireplace. She tried to picture the fields around the farmhouse. But the memories already felt farther away than 2 days. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found an elderly maid carrying a basket of towels. The woman offered a gentle smile. "You look frightened." Elena managed a weak smile in return. "Is it that obvious?" The maid's eyes softened. "Everyone looks frightened their first day." Then her gaze drifted toward the silver chain hanging from a hook outside the room. The smile faded slightly. "Especially when they arrive the way you did." For the first time, Elena realized she was not the first person whose life had changed the moment they entered Ravencrest Palace. The days that followed settled into a routine that felt both exhausting and strangely invisible. Elena woke before sunrise each morning and joined dozens of other servants moving quietly through the palace corridors. She polished silver, carried linens, delivered trays, and memorized hallways that seemed to stretch for miles. The palace never truly slept. Even in the earliest hours, footsteps echoed across marble floors and distant voices drifted through open doorways. At first, Elena kept to herself. She lowered her eyes, completed every task she was given, and tried not to attract attention. Yet attention found her anyway. Not from nobles. Most of them barely seemed aware she existed. It came from the servants. The kitchen staff noticed when she stayed late to help clean after her shift ended. The laundry workers noticed when she carried extra baskets for an older maid whose back often ached. The stable hands noticed when nervous horses calmed almost immediately after she approached them with a gentle voice and patient touch. Elena never thought much about these small acts. They simply felt natural. Kindness cost nothing, and sometimes it was the only thing she still possessed. One rainy afternoon, she was delivering fresh towels to an upper corridor when she heard a muffled cough behind a partially open door. Pausing, she glanced inside. An elderly servant sat alone on a chair, breathing heavily as he tried to organize a stack of records. His hands trembled so badly that several papers slipped to the floor. Elena hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. "May I help?" The old man looked surprised. "You have your own duties. They can wait." 2 minutes. She gathered the scattered papers and arranged them neatly on the desk. The man studied her quietly. "You are the new Court Omega." The title still felt strange every time she heard it. Elena offered a small nod. "My name is Elena." The old servant smiled faintly. "Then Elena it is." Word of moments like that spread farther than she realized. Within weeks, people throughout the service wing knew who she was. Some greeted her by name. Others saved her a seat during meals. A few even shared stories about their families and lives beyond the palace walls. For the first time since arriving in Ravencrest, Elena felt something unexpected. She felt less alone. Yet every reminder of belonging came with another reminder of reality. Each evening, as she returned to her small room, she passed the silver chain hanging outside her door. Palace regulations required it to remain there as a visible mark of bonded service. The sight never failed to tighten something inside her chest. No matter how kind the servants became, no matter how familiar the corridors felt, the chain remained. It greeted her every night and every morning. It reminded her that her future belonged to someone else. One evening, as she stared at it in silence, the elderly maid who had welcomed her on her first day appeared beside her. The woman followed Elena's gaze and sighed softly. "Do not let that thing tell you who you are." Elena looked up. "It is difficult not to." The maid's eyes carried a sadness that suggested she understood perfectly. "Then remember this instead," she said. "People reveal their true character when they have every reason to become bitter and choose kindness anyway." Elena lowered her eyes thoughtfully. For the first time in weeks, the chain seemed a little lighter. Not because it weighed less, but because someone had reminded her that it did not define the person wearing it. By the beginning of the 3rd month, Elena had learned something important about Ravencrest Palace. The grand halls and glittering chandeliers showed only half the truth. Beneath the beauty lived an invisible world of servants, cooks, cleaners, stable workers, and attendants who carried the weight of the kingdom without ever receiving recognition for it. Elena had become part of that world. Most days passed quietly, but not all of them. Certain nobles viewed bonded servants as little more than decorations. They expected perfection and rarely offered gratitude. Elena endured their dismissive comments with the same patience she brought to every challenge. She reminded herself that anger would not change her circumstances. One afternoon, she was arranging fresh flowers in a reception room when two young noblewomen entered. Their expensive gowns swept across the floor as they laughed among themselves. Elena immediately stepped aside and lowered her gaze. One of the women stopped near the window and noticed the silver chain attached to Elena's belt. "That is the village girl everyone keeps talking about," she said. The other examined Elena with open curiosity. "She looks ordinary enough." Elena focused on the flowers. She had learned that silence was often safer than speaking. Unfortunately, silence did not always make people lose interest. "Tell me," the first noblewoman said, taking another step closer. "Do you miss your little farm?" The question sounded harmless, but the amusement in her voice revealed its true purpose. Elena felt her chest tighten. Images of Ashbrook flashed briefly through her mind. The fields. The farmhouse. Her aunt. She missed all of it every day. Still, she answered politely. "Yes, my lady." The women exchanged amused smiles before continuing on their way. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it lingered long after they left. That evening, Elena sat alone beside the small window in her room. Rain tapped softly against the glass. She rested her chin against her knees and stared at the courtyard below. Sometimes homesickness arrived quietly. Other times it felt like a wave strong enough to pull the air from her lungs. Tonight was one of those nights. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found a young kitchen assistant named Thomas holding a covered plate. "You missed supper," he said. Elena blinked in surprise. "I was not hungry." Thomas lifted an eyebrow. "That is not what Mrs. Hawthorne said." Mrs. Hawthorne was the elderly maid who seemed to notice everything. Elena could not help smiling. Thomas handed her the plate. Warm bread and vegetable stew filled the air with comforting aromas. "Everyone was worried about you," he said. Elena looked down at the food. For a moment she could not speak. Nobody outside her family had ever worried about her before. After Thomas left, she sat on the edge of her bed holding the plate in both hands. The loneliness had not disappeared, but something else existed beside it now. Friendship. Quiet kindness. Small reminders that she mattered to people. As she looked toward the silver chain hanging near the door, Elena realized something had changed. The chain still represented her circumstances. It still represented the life she had not chosen. But for the first time, it no longer felt like the only thing defining her future. The announcement arrived on a cold morning just as servants gathered in the lower hall to receive their assignments. Excited whispers spread faster than footsteps. Trays were forgotten. Brooms paused in midair. Even the stern supervisors seemed distracted. Elena looked up from the basket of linens she carried and noticed the unusual energy immediately. "What happened?" she asked Thomas quietly. His eyes widened. "The king is returning today." The words rippled through the room. For a moment, every conversation seemed to merge into one. The king. Elena had heard countless stories about Lucian Blackthorne during her months at Ravencrest. Some painted him as a brilliant ruler. Others described him as distant and impossible to read. A few claimed he could walk into a crowded room and silence it without speaking a single word. Yet despite living in the palace, Elena had never seen him. His campaigns and royal duties kept him away for much of the year. By noon, preparations had transformed the entire palace. Fresh banners hung from balconies. Polished armor gleamed in the corridors. Servants rushed from one task to another while nobles arrived dressed in their finest clothing. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation. Elena spent most of the afternoon helping arrange reception tables in one of the grand halls. As she worked, she noticed how differently everyone carried themselves. People stood straighter. Voices became more careful. Even the most arrogant nobles appeared eager to make a favorable impression. The effect fascinated her. One man could alter the atmosphere of an entire kingdom simply by returning home. Late in the day, a sudden movement near the windows caught everyone's attention. Carriages rolled into the main courtyard below. Royal guards took their positions. Excited murmurs swept through the hall. Elena instinctively stepped back toward the wall, allowing others a better view. She was not supposed to stand among nobles. She knew her place. Still, curiosity tugged at her. Through the tall glass windows, she could see figures dismounting in the courtyard. Soldiers. Advisors. Officials. Then a taller figure emerged from the center of the group. The reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped. Nobles straightened. Servants lowered their eyes. Elena could not explain why, but her heartbeat quickened. The man moved with calm confidence across the courtyard stones. Black royal armor reflected the fading sunlight. A crimson cloak flowed behind him. Dark hair rested against broad shoulders. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakable about him. Power did not announce itself. It simply existed. Elena only saw him for a few seconds before the procession disappeared inside another wing of the palace. Yet somehow those few seconds stayed with her. Strange. She had expected someone intimidating. Instead, she felt something else. Curiosity. That evening, while helping clear dishes from a reception chamber, Elena overheard several officials discussing reports delivered to the king. Most of the conversation meant little to her until one sentence caught her attention. His Majesty requested information regarding bonded service records. Elena froze. The tray in her hand suddenly felt heavier. Bonded service records. People like her. The officials continued speaking, but their voices faded beneath the rush of thoughts filling her mind. Why would the king be interested in such records? She lowered her gaze and continued. Working. Yet long after the conversation ended, the question remained. Somewhere within the palace, Lucian Blackthorn had returned. And for reasons Elena could not begin to understand, his attention seemed to be moving toward the very system that had brought her there. The invitation arrived 2 days later. Elena stared at the folded parchment in confusion. Bonded servants were rarely summoned to formal royal gatherings unless specific duties required their presence. Yet her name, or rather her designation, appeared clearly on the assignment list posted outside the service hall. Court Omega 17. Grand Banquet Service. Reporting time, 6 o'clock sharp. Around her, whispers immediately began. Several servants exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas frowned as he read the notice over her shoulder. That is strange. Elena looked up. Why? He hesitated. The winter banquet is usually handled by senior attendants. Before he could say more, one of the supervisors approached and ordered everyone back to work. The conversation ended, but the uneasy feeling remained. Throughout the following day, Elena noticed other strange details. Noble guests arrived in unusually large numbers. Additional seating was arranged inside the grand hall. Decorations covered every available surface. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of points of golden light across the polished marble floors. Everything felt larger than necessary. More crowded. More deliberate. By evening, the palace buzzed with anticipation. Elena changed into the formal gray uniform assigned to banquet service and joined the other attendants gathering near the entrance. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth inside the hall. The silver chain remained attached to her belt as required by regulation. She tried not to think about it. Just get through the evening, she quietly told herself. The massive doors opened. Guests began entering. The room filled with conversation, music, and laughter. Nobles in elegant clothing moved between tables while servants carried trays through carefully planned routes. Elena focused on her work. Deliver the drinks. Clear the plates. Avoid attention. It was a simple plan. Unfortunately, the evening seemed determined to make that impossible. As the hours passed, she noticed several nobles watching her. Not casually. Intentionally. Their expressions carried the same curiosity she had seen months earlier from the young noblewomen in the reception room. Except now there was something else mixed in. Expectation. The feeling unsettled her. Near the center of the hall sat King Lucian Blackthorn. This was the first time Elena had seen him up close. Even from across the room, his presence seemed impossible to ignore. Black royal armor reflected the candlelight. The crimson cloak resting across his chair stood out against the sea of expensive fabrics surrounding him. He listened more than he spoke. Observed more than he reacted. Several powerful nobles competed for his attention throughout the evening, yet somehow he appeared detached from all of it. Elena lowered her eyes whenever she found herself looking in his direction. A servant had no reason to study a king. Then something unexpected happened. A young kitchen assistant carrying a tray stumbled near one of the noble tables. Glasses rattled. Several guests gasped. The boy froze in panic, clearly expecting punishment. Without thinking, Elena stepped forward and steadied the tray before anything could fall. "It is all right," she whispered. "Take a breath." Relief flooded the boy's face. Around them, a few nobles exchanged irritated looks. Others seemed amused. Elena quickly returned to her duties, unaware that someone had witnessed the entire exchange. Across the hall, King Lucian's gaze followed her for several seconds longer than necessary. Beside him, one of the court lords leaned forward with a knowing smile. "There she is," the noble quietly said. Lucian's expression did not change. "Who?" The lord glanced toward Elena. "The bonded Omega everyone keeps talking about." For the first time that evening, the king's attention settled completely on the young woman wearing the silver chain. Elena felt the weight of the king's attention long before she dared to look in his direction. The banquet continued around her, filled with music, conversation, and the clinking of silverware, yet something had shifted. She could sense it in the sudden glances exchanged between nobles. She could feel it in the strange silence that followed whenever she passed a table. Trying to ignore the growing tension, she focused on her duties. One tray after another. One table after another. Keep moving. Keep working. But fate seemed determined to place her directly in the center of the evening. Near the end of the banquet, an elderly servant carrying a heavy serving dish lost his balance beside the main aisle. Gasps echoed through the hall as the man stumbled. Without hesitation, Elena rushed forward and caught the dish before it could crash onto the marble floor. The effort nearly pulled her off balance as well, but she managed to steady both herself and the older servant. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. The man nodded, embarrassed. Elena offered him a reassuring smile before helping him regain his footing. It was a small moment. A simple act. The kind of thing she would have done anywhere. Yet when she straightened, she discovered the entire hall had gone strangely quiet. Her heartbeat faltered. Slowly, she followed everyone's gaze toward the head of the room. King Lucian Blackthorn was watching her. Not the way a ruler observed a servant. Not the way a noble studied a curiosity. There was something far more focused in his expression. Something thoughtful. Elena immediately lowered her eyes and stepped back. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Around the room, whispers began spreading from table to table. The court lord seated beside the king leaned closer and spoke softly. "That is the one I mentioned." Lucian remained silent for several moments. Then he asked a question that caused several nearby nobles to exchange startled looks. "Why is she bonded?" The lord appeared surprised. "A debt settlement, your majesty." Standard procedure. Lucian's gaze shifted briefly toward the silver chain attached to Elena's belt. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Standard does not always mean right. The words were spoken quietly, yet they carried through the silence like distant thunder. Elena did not hear them clearly from across the hall, but others did. The atmosphere changed immediately. For the first time, several nobles looked uncomfortable. As the evening finally came to an end, guests began departing. Servants moved quickly to clear tables and extinguish candles. Elena worked in a haze of confusion. The king's reaction made no sense. Why would a ruler concern himself with someone like her? Hours later, after the hall had emptied, she returned to her small room. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Yet sleep refused to come. She sat beside the window and stared at the moonlit courtyard below. The silver chain hung beside the door exactly where it always had. Familiar. Unchanging. Permanent. Or so she thought. Somewhere else within Ravencrest Palace, King Lucian Blackthorn stood alone in his private study reviewing bonded service records long after midnight. One file remained open on his desk. Elena Whitmore. As his eyes moved across the details of her case, his jaw tightened. The more he read, the less satisfied he became. Outside the tall windows, the kingdom slept peacefully. Inside the palace, a decision was beginning to take shape. And by dawn, the future that Elena believed was fixed forever would already be starting to change.